decided that this year, perhaps one of the key topics would be democracy, which I think you heard earlier, how it is working with great difficulties at this multi-layered institution that we have here in Europe. And that's why we are particularly happy to have here Harold James, Professor of History at Princeton. He's the author of many books, one of which we discussed a few days ago here, which was the Euro and the Battle of Ideas, where you concentrate on the Euro crisis. He has actually also earlier authored a book, Europe Reborn. Let us see whether he still stands to that optimistic outlook. But today we would like to concentrate more on the broader question of democracy. What are the dangers? What are the prospects? And of course, since we are here in Brussels and since we just heard the conference about the future of Europe, what are the prospects for democracy in Europe? Is the European Union a construction which actually helps or hinders the development of democracy? And these are some of the themes which Harold will address. I will give him the floor now for an introduction, and then I hope we have a lively exchange also with the public to see what the ideas he brings us, how they jive with what we heard earlier from the many proposals, both in detailed terms at the Ideas Lab, at the individual sessions, and at the previous session, where it becomes much more concrete, namely the question how to actually make democracy operate in Europe today. Without further ado, Harold, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's really great being here. It's been a terrific 2 days. I've learned a lot. I've been very happy to have been invited to give this academic lecture, and it's a great honor for me to do that. So I begin by noting that this is an academic lecture. I'm an academic, so I'm not representing any institution, and I think it's important to have this. I think it's an excellent idea to finish off the event with such a presentation, because academics have been responsible for putting around an enormous number of very bad ideas. So what I want to do is to examine some of those bad ideas and to try to see whether we can map out together maybe, and as a result of the discussions that we've been having over the last days, map out a road to a democratic system that really works. In the previous session, there was a very, very interesting tension between, really big tension, between deliberative democracy and representative democracy. And there was a lot of searching about what deliberative democracy might be. I think that gets to the answer of some of the questions that seem to me to be really important, in the sense that democracy is, yes, it's an expansive term, and some people, we had in the panel before, that it's like motherhood and apple pie, that everybody is in favor of democracy. And of course, if you go around Europe, if you go around the world, the people that you may want to criticize are also going to say that they're Democrats. Mr. Trump will say that he's the biggest Democrat. Mr. Duterte will say that he's a Democrat. Mr. Putin will say that he's a Democrat. So everybody is a Democrat. And if that's the case, you might as well say what's the problem? Why don't we go home? But there is a problem, and I'm grateful that Daniel brought up the book that I'd done in the early 2000s with a rather optimistic title, Europe Reborn, and the question was, have I rethought that? Well, indeed I have. And just a few months ago, there was a second edition of this with a different title. It's now called, it's not Europe Reborn anymore, it's Europe Contested, and then with a subtitle, From the Kaiser to Brexit, in other words, from before the First World War to the 31st of January this year. So what is democracy, and what should we be looking for? What's the problem? Yes, I think you need a big perspective. Democracy, as it's currently practiced, is really very, very recent. Democracy, for a very long time, meant what you see on this screen. What you see on this screen is a 19th century imagination of what ancient Greek democracy looked like. And the point about ancient Greek democracy is that it's, of course, deliberative. Everybody can get together in the square and they talk and they listen. So what you see here is the depiction of Pericles' funeral oration. And Pericles' funeral oration, I think you could really go with that and think that this is in a way what an ideal of democracy should look like. Just 2 points from the funeral oration. Far from exercising a jealous surveillance over each other, we do not feel called upon to be angry with a neighbor for doing what he likes. So you mustn't correct too much. And secondly, we throw open our city to the world and never by alien acts exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning and observing, although the eyes of an enemy may reasonably profit from our liberality. So it's a vision of an open society and a society that discusses, but that doesn't condemn each other. You've got to be in a dialogue. That's the idea of this. But how does that operate outside a framework like a city-state? To some extent, some of the Italian city-states in the later Middle Ages tried this. The Swiss cantons, the original Swiss cantons, Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, yes, the citizens could meet and they could discuss. But in a modern world, that doesn't look so likely. So we're not in the world of meeting in the, that was another word that I heard in the panel discussion at the end, in the agora on the Areopagus. Don't meet there. But how does it work in the modern world? Well, in a sense, what's being done in the modern world is that a artificial community is being created in national settings. That's really the work of the 19th century and the 20th century, but that's what creates the framework and creates the sense of a community in which there's debate and in which democratic practice can take place. But it's really problematical. How do we really know that we belong to that community? At the beginning of the 19th century, I don't believe that most Europeans did feel that they were part of a national community. And there's a substantial literature. I'm just going to pull out one. I mean, I think it's probably the most famous and really the best illustration of this principle by the American historian Eugen Weber, Peasants into Frenchmen, written quite a long time ago now in the 1970s, where Weber thinks about how a disaggregated mass of people became, by the end of the 19th century, conscious and aware and proud that they were French. So Weber thinks of it in terms of a communications revolution. So it's in part the railroad that brings France together. The railroad is also an instrument of market integration. It unifies previously disaggregated markets. But it's also the educational system, the school system. So in the Third Republic, very famously, again, it's a caricature that I think everybody is familiar with. The Minister of Education could look at the watch and say, at this moment, each grade, he knows what each grade in the French Republic is studying, which page of Julius Caesar's De Bello Gallico is being studied. You can see that exactly. Education and military service is the other one that brings the French people together. And the conscious decision in France, and not all European countries did this, but the conscious decision in France not to have regionally specific military units, not to have regiments that came from a particular area, but to mix everybody up so that you thought that you were indeed French. So that's what creates this community. And the challenge is, I think, to think, and I want to return to that right at the end, what the equivalent might be in the 21st century, because it looks really as if this model is as broken as many other things in the contemporary world are broken. But I said I would examine bad ideas. And one of the ideas that's around, I think, that really deserves a bit more critical analysis is that we're living through a really big crisis of democracy. And you'd originally invited my friend from Harvard, Professor Ziblatt, to give a talk on why democracies die. And so in the spirit of Ziblatt, I thought I should also talk about what the dangers are, because 20th century Europe in particular, and the discussion of the problem of democracy, is really, I think, overshadowed by one particular or one dramatic failure. And that's the failure of democracy in interwar Germany, the failure of the Republic, whose constitution was proclaimed in the small, very much associated with classical German literature, historic city of Weimar, the city of Goethe and Schiller and Herder. The Weimar Republic was destroyed, and everybody, I think, draws lessons from Weimar. I like to talk about Weimar myself as well, because I started off as a historian of the Weimar Republic. So I'm going to do some historical comparison. Weimar was constructed as the perfect democracy. The best professors of political science, the best academics that you could possibly get were all summoned to make the new constitution. Hugo Preuss, the most famous probably was Max Weber. Max Weber, it's worth thinking about because Max Weber, great German legal theorist, economist, sociologist, historian really, a constitutional writer, died in June 1920 of the Spanish flu. So when we're thinking of epidemics, Weber was a victim of the flu epidemic, but the Weimar Republic was a victim. This kind of figure in various forms is, I think, absolutely on everybody's mind in the modern European discussion. And it's the story of the squeezing of the center of the democratic middle and the rise of extreme parties on the right and on the left. On this figure, the Nazi party, the NSDAP, is colored in brown. They wore brown shirts, and the Communist Party is colored in dark red. And you can see very clearly what happens on that figure. That is that the far left increases its votes in the last years of the Republic, and the far right increases its votes, and the consequence is that there's a complete impossibility of democracy because the center doesn't have a majority, even all the parties, and there's a vast range of parties in between that. There's a conservative liberal party and a conservative party and a left-wing liberal party and a Catholic party and a socialist party, social democratic party. It's a very, very big range of parties. But even if, with the best will in the world, if they all got together, they couldn't get a majority in the parliament. And on the other hand, the majority of the extremes is also absolutely unthinkable. So you have actually this is the destruction of democracy. And this is the kind of thing that everybody is alluding to when they're thinking of the failure of democracy, and they look back and they think about the Weimar Republic. So very briefly, some lessons on this. What went wrong? Can we explain it? And this, in a way, is the spirit of the Ziblatt book and of many other recent books. What goes badly wrong with democracy? First of all, notice it's right at the end that this all collapses. So it's between 1930 and 1933, and that is, of course, the Great Depression, so the great economic collapse. And it's probably not surprising that big economic collapses will strain, impossibly overstrain, destroy democracies, inflations, deflations, high levels of unemployment. So another thing that I think is obvious from this is that there are too many parties, and a proliferation of parties is destructive. There was a kind of confusion in the minds of people, and they looked at these enormous ballot papers with enormous lists of parties and found it deeply confusing. And one of the things that the Hitler movement, the NSDAP, did to appeal to people was to call itself not a party but a movement. So it said, we're not a party because we don't divide up the people into little fragments, but we're a movement that is going to encompass everybody. But then there are some less obvious lessons from the Weimar Republic. I will be very brief. Some of them were even mentioned in the panel discussion up to now. Referenda are pretty dangerous. So the beginning of the destruction of the Weimar Republic was not even the election of September 1930, which propelled the NSDAP into great prominence, but a plebiscite or a referendum on the reparations plan held the year before. You can also see in the figure that the premature dissolution of parliaments because you're unhappy with parliaments is often not going to produce a better solution. And I think if you look for modern examples, one of the most obvious examples of how exactly this process works is in contemporary Israel. And it's not really a coincidence at all in that the makers of the Israeli constitution were mostly people who had drawn and lived through Weimar, but actually replicated this allegedly perfect constitution of the Weimar Republic. Constitutions aren't necessarily a protection. Business lobbying is pernicious. Polarizing rhetoric is highly, highly destructive. And there are dangers that come from the personal intrigues around the president's family. If you're telling a micro-narrative of the last years of the Weimar Republic, it's impossible to do that without taking into account the man who was president of the Republic, by now senile, suffered from Alzheimer's disease, the great military figure from the First World War, Paul von Hindenburg. He's there with the man who was appointed chancellor in January 1933. Hindenburg, suffering from Alzheimer's, but pushed around by his family into a series of dramatic intrigues. And finally, two other thoughts on Weimar. You don't need to have an overall majority in order to completely blow up a democratic system. So that's a lesson that many modern people who call themselves Democrats but are aiming at the overthrow of democracy also want to imitate. You don't need to have an overall majority. The best result that the NSDAP ever got in a democratic election was in the summer of 1932, when they got 37% of the vote. And then, because of this process of continually dissolving parliaments and hoping that there will be a better one, in November 1932, they fell down to 33%. And another one that I think has also some contemporary relevance is that if you're threatened, you can try to hold on to power by aggressive fiscal policies and aggressive action, but it doesn't last forever, and then in the end, reality comes and hits you, and that's the story of the years after 1930 and the years of the Great Depression. So this is a story of failure, and this is the story of the country that first of all destroyed democracy in its own setting and then expanded this system all over Europe through military force, but also through the cooperation in many countries of existing elites who were also disappointed with a discredited democracy. So people go back to this experience and they think, you know, how in Europe in particular can you build a better system? And the better system looks like this great success story after the Second World War. So, you know, why were we so confident that democracies would really work? Well, I mean, it was very, very simple in many countries. And very, very crude, sorry, but in a kind of overview like this, I have to be very crude. A division in big countries, you don't get multi-party systems. You get one party, big party of the center-left and one big party of the center-right. In smaller countries, there may be coalitions, but smaller countries can always say, well, we really need to cooperate because we are, after all, a national community. They feel more like the people in the Agora or sitting on the Areopagus. They really feel more of a solidarity. But in a big country, in the Big Four in particular, in the UK, in Italy, in France, in Germany, a big center-right party and a big center-left party are the solution to the problem. And that looks extraordinarily stable for a very long period of time. And it's stable, again, this is a kind of grotesque oversimplification, but I think it's actually a valid one. It's stable because both the center-left and the center-right parties are going to be pushed to reasonableness, rationality, communication, and they have to compete for the median voter. And if you think about it, most of the issues that they're discussing, most of the contentious party political issues, are about distributional issues in this period. And it's quite simple. Again, a little bit oversimplified, but it's a story. The center-left wants to redistribute more, and the center-right wants to redistribute less. But the center-right can't go back on redistribution altogether, because if it did that, it would lose the median voter, and the center-left can't be really radical and do big-scale taxation, because then it too would lose the median voter. So you live in this completely rational and completely stable world. And this is the world that existed while I was growing up, many of you were growing up in this world, some of you grew up in a completely different world. The world, as we knew it on this slide, was destroyed in Italy in the 1990s. So first the Communist Party was discredited after the collapse of communism, and the Christian Democrats were discredited in a series of corruption scandals. The interesting thing, though, is that exactly this disintegration is happening everywhere else now. So it's happening in France. It happened spectacularly in the last presidential election in France, where the candidate didn't come from the center-left or from the center-right. It's the story of the self-destruction of the British Conservatives and the self-destruction of the British Labour Party. And what's come, I think we can talk about that, but it's not the traditional Conservative Party anymore. It's the progressive erosion of the SPD in Germany, and now also the crisis of the CDU. So Germany is less on this path than any of the other big countries, but they've all moved in this direction. So why is that? And that's the other big idea that I think academics have pushed into the world in a slightly dubious form, and that's what I want to devote the rest of the presentation to thinking about with you. Because for a substantial number of people, what is changing in this story, what is changing since the 1990s, where Italy was hit first, but then everywhere else begins to be hit, what is changing is that these are the years of globalization. So the simple story that many people will tell you is that globalization destroys or undermines democracy. And you can see it in terms of the party political operations. And I can see the logic of the argument, so let me set it out before I pick it apart. The logic of the argument is that this center-left, center-right trade-off only works as long as you don't have a substantial flow of factors outside the national setting. Because the whole question of redistribution assumes that basically everything stays within a national community. That's the whole point of national fiscal systems. But once it becomes the case that if you put corporate tax too high, corporations might leave. If you put individual income taxes too high, individuals might leave. Then you get into a very, very different kind of area. And so the story of the post-1990s world seems to be that the mobility of factors is the fundamental force that's leading to this crisis of democracy. So I don't believe that, and I want to try to convince you that this is not the right analysis, but it's a very, very powerful one. And so it's sometimes presented, I think, one very memorable version of it is in David Goodhart's work, where he thinks of the division between people who are globalists. If you look at the rhetoric of populists, globalists are always the enemy. Donald Trump loves giving speeches against globalists. So he doesn't say he's anti-democratic, but he says he's pushing back against the globalists in favor of the people of his own country. So the somewheres are people who can't be globalized and who suffer from globalization, and the anywheres are people who benefit from globalization. And if you translate that onto this little schematic party preference world that I tried to sketch out, you can see that both the center-left and the center-right identified themselves since the 1990s as parties of the globalizing group, that the modernization of social democratic parties, the kind of Tony Blair or Gerhard Schröder story, was exactly part of making the Social Democrats of the old style, who were very, very firmly rooted in local traditions, into the party of anywheres. So let me just drill down a bit more into this discussion of globalization and think, what are the aspects of globalization that are so controversial? Well, I thought also I wanted to talk about the modern problems in Europe, these multiple crises, long-term crisis of growth that's also linked to globalization, tensions over debt, monetary union, what's the role of the euro in a global world, tensions over migration is clearly about globalization. The environment is a global issue, security and geopolitics, they're all global issues. So these are the global issues that come up. What are the particular answers that are given? So the first story that is very commonly told is that the radicalization of politics, the turning away from the traditional parties of these center-left, center-right visions of Tony Blair, Gerhard Schröder world, they're driven by the trade impact of globalization. And maybe that makes sense. I think if you think of the Italian story, you can certainly construct something very plausible along those lines, because Italy is affected earlier and more harshly by the globalization shock because of the kind of industrial structure that Italy had than other European countries are. And so people have spent a great deal of energy modeling this and trying to get empirical demonstrations of the way in which the exposure to global shocks, the exposure to China, for instance, Chinese trade since the opening of China started in the 80s, but it really takes off in the 90s and accelerates after the 2000s because of the entry into the WTO. So the most famous European set of authors who deal with this, Bocconi, Piero Stanig, and Italo Colantoni, they replicate a study that was done in the United States and that shows that it's those areas that are exposed to the Chinese competition that vote for the radical alternatives, or vote for Donald Trump, or vote for Brexit. One of the Colantoni Stanig papers deals exactly with the Brexit referendum. We're seeing some kind of working out of this particular problematic because the anti-trade rhetoric was powerful and attractive in the 2016 presidential election in the United States. But the implementation of it is patchy and sporadic. And as it gets implemented, or as it's threatened to be implemented, some basic principles become much clearer and more obvious. And one of those is that cutting yourself off from trade does nothing for the poorer people in society. In fact, there's another substantial literature that shows you how poorer people are more adversely hit by anti-trade measures or protectionist measures than better off people. And again, I think, I obviously can't go through the detailed empirics of it, but the intuition behind it is very, very obvious. If you look at your smartphone and think, well, would it be a terrible blow to me if it cost $500 or $1,000 more? Well, no, I could afford that, actually, in honesty, and many of you could afford that. But poor people who like smartphones, need smartphones as well in terms of being able to communicate with each other and to maintain the kind of modern style of life, they are intensely badly affected by that. And so the idea at the end of last year of having a tariff increase just before Christmas, the administration realized that this was a complete impossibility. And it's also, I think, in terms of another argument, if you think that you can create jobs by doing protectionism, it's a really difficult argument to make because most of those jobs are already lost and they're not going to be recreated by high levels of protection. So the trade argument is spurious. The migration argument, I think, is more important to modern European politics, to modern American politics as well. Worries about immigration, worries about emigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. We heard yesterday very, very powerfully and very eloquently from Ivan Krastev about that subject. So emigration is, from peripheral Europe, immigration in Northern Europe and Western Europe is a problem, and it's explosive and it's linked to cultural fears. Is that new? No, it's not at all new. It's a very, very old phenomenon. And to use Max Weber again, since I already mentioned Max Weber, Max Weber's first major piece of academic research was about the question of the immigration of Polish migrant agricultural workers into Eastern Germany. And he used that to make the very, very, not very pleasant, very polemical, very, really thoroughly discreditable argument that he didn't call it globalization, but he called it opening of borders, was clearly not something that was compatible with the advancement of knowledge and science, since an inferior people, and he called the Poles an inferior people, were demonstrably pushing out against the superior people. So he said, if the, to stereotype the argument, if there's more globalization, it's going to lead to the victory of inferior peoples over superior peoples. That was the very, very nationalist argument that Max Weber made then. So the migration argument is still going to be around. The argument about, if you think of what globalization is comprised of, movements of goods, people think of probably first, movements of people, movements of capital. Movements of capital become very, very problematic after big financial crises. So it seems to me that this third element is something that was given a push by the financial crisis of 2008, in the same way as deglobalization in the interwar world and the destruction of democracy in the interwar world were driven by the aftermath of the financial crisis during the Great Depression. And if you want to see the most vivid demonstration of this, and it's got stunning overtones of modern political rhetoric. So people in modern Germany sometimes sound as if they're making the same point. People in modern Britain, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, seemed to be making a similar point. Donald Trump often makes a similar point to this. You should look at the video of a speech to workers in Berlin on the 10th of November, 1933. So Adolf Hitler was speaking there to an audience that had probably mostly not voted for him. Working class people, most of the working class didn't vote for the Nazi Party, but it was not an unsympathetic audience, and this is what he talked about in November 1933. He attacked people who are at home nowhere and everywhere, who do not have a soil on which they've grown up, but who live in Berlin today, in Brussels tomorrow, Paris the day after that, and then again in Prague or Vienna or London, and who feel at home everywhere and nowhere. Those are the only ones who can really be described as international elements. The people cannot follow them because the people is chained to its soil, to its home, to the life chances of its state, of the nation. So that's actually the most powerful version of the David Goodhart proposition of the revolt of the somewheres, the people who are tied to their soil, to their country, against the anywhere. And you notice one thing about this speech, and if you see it, there's a film recording of it. It's relatively easily accessible on one of these YouTube videos. If you look at it, you'll see something dramatic, which is that Hitler, in this speech, never once says the Jews, but it's clear who he means. And somebody in the audience does shout out at that point, the Jews. So it's clearly racially motivated, but Hitler is not going to point that out in this particular speech. This is the background of these revolts against mobility. Let me come then to my thought about what's right and what's not right about the contemporary analysis. And so the most famous analysis of the kind of problems that I've been talking about is in a series of articles and then a really nice book on the problem of globalization by Danny Roderick at Harvard, that he has what he calls a trilemma between globalization or capital mobility, democracy, and national sovereignty. So those three elements. National sovereignty, I'm sorry, if you're looking at this slide, I've put in a slightly different slide, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But the fundamental Roderick trilemma are those three. Globalization, democracy, and national sovereignty. And those of you who are economists, I don't think I need to say this, but if you're not an economist, what Roderick is calling on is a literature that started, formalized in the 1960s on international macroeconomics, on the trilemma that you couldn't have at the same time independent monetary policy, fixed exchange rates, and open capital movements. And so it looks very analogous. Open capital movements are like the story of globalization. The fixed exchange rate is tying yourself into an international system, and the independent monetary policy is what we think that democracy might do if democracy were to be applied in the area of monetary policy, that you would get a democratic impact. And the argument is that you can't have all three of those. Well, recently, the discussion of that macroeconomic trilemma, I think, has been pushed back, and people don't really believe anymore, or most people don't believe anymore, that you get a great deal of independence in monetary policy just by having your own exchange rate. And so Helen Ray and others have said it's not really a trilemma, it's a dilemma, and that globalization has flattened out that old paradox. But I had a kind of different take on this. Since I had this kind of flash of imagination in a very peculiar place, I thought I would take you to that place. And that is the great art gallery in Munich, the Alta Pinakothek. And this painting in particular by the great master of the High Renaissance, Raphael, the Canigiani Holy Family. I think you can see very quickly, at least I hope you may be able to see very quickly, what I got out of this, which is that the trilemma is the wrong way of asking the question. So Raphael clearly constructs as the center of this picture of the Holy Family a triangle. The graphic representation is clearly of a triangle. And if you were Danny Roderick, you would want to crawl along the edges of that triangle, and you would end up with the toe of the Madonna, probably. That's an extreme point. Or the shepherd's staff of the old man of Joseph. But that's not the interest of the picture at all. Of course it's not the interest of the picture. The interest of the picture is right in the center of the triangle. So the Holy Child is right in the center of the triangle. And it's in fact, I think, exactly the story that I would apply to the macroeconomic trilemma in the 1960s. That is, that you don't absolutely ever have completely fixed exchange rates. A completely fixed exchange rate is an illusion because you can always change the exchange rate. I mean, you know, we've gone through lots of experiences like this. Argentina in the 1990s tried to completely tie up its exchange rate, so it was so hard that it would be absolutely impossible ever to dismantle that exchange rate. But in the end, you know, faced by the crisis, of course they can do it. We don't have absolute capital mobility. Capital is always going to be more domestic, and we don't even in the periods when national capital markets looked as if they were relatively self-contained, we don't have even then completely autonomous monetary policy, but there are spillovers and transactions across frontiers. In exactly the same way, I want to suggest to you, you should treat the globalization paradox, Danny Roderick's globalization paradox. And so if people tell you the message that you thought I might have been saying in the middle of the presentation, that globalization is what's destroying contemporary democracy, that I think is wrong. You can have various kinds of globalization. You can have various kinds of democratic involvement, democratic engagement, and you can have various kinds of national sovereignty. You're not going to have absolute versions of any of them. And it's exactly in that kind of center area of the picture that I think you will get the most interesting historical trade-offs and contemporary trade-offs as well. In that, and you know, you can take it for other examples. I think if you think of you know, what you need to do to deal with the virus, with the coronavirus. There's obviously a version of that says, you know, if you just stop everybody from moving, you know, if you don't allow Daniel to do his conferences, you stop absolutely everybody from moving, then you could contain the virus. Well, I'm not sure that that's right. You know, people tried this in the Middle Ages, and you know, basically, even very, very isolated villages got infected, got contaminated, got contagion with the plague. So the plague didn't just stop in big commercial centers, but it spread all over Europe. It's true that for some time in the 18th century, there was less transmission of the plague because of the big demilitarized frontier zone on the boundary between the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. But basically, you know, even complete cutoff doesn't really protect you. So you can't go back on globalization completely. And you know, I think the discussion of trade, I hope also the discussion of migration will show you that it's absolutely foolish to try to do that. And we've got many, many instances of this. One of my colleagues in Princeton Douglas Massey, has done a lot of work on the migration across the Mexican-American frontier, the Mexican-US frontier. And the story of that is, if you make it harder to cross the frontier, and successive governments have been trying to do that for quite a long time, if you make it harder to cross, you don't affect the overall net migration at all. But what you do is you affect the gross migration, because before, when it was very easy to cross the frontier, lots of people went backwards and forwards. And now when they come over, they don't want to go back again. It's really, really hard to deal with migration with walls or frontiers. You're going to have some level of globalization. So, when you think about how democracy reacts to that, democracy is about managing coherent responses to globalization. The triangle that I showed is a variant of the Roderick trilemma, and it gives you a different kind of trilemma with international order as one of the variants of it, as international order, multilateralism as a way of trying to think of what holds the world together. And that, I think, is a really powerful thought as well, and it applies very much to my historical example, but to contemporary examples as well, in that in the history, while the international system was working in the 1920s, countries, even if they had very potentially aggressive and nationalistic leaders, had to basically conform with the rules. If you look at how, for instance, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini behaves in the middle and the late 1920s, it's very restrained and very orthodox. The moment that the Depression occurs and the moment that the international legal system collapses and the League of Nations is discredited after 1931 and the Japanese invasion in Manchuria, then Mussolini unleashes his aggressive quality. I think if you want to have a discussion in modern Russia, this was, by the way, one of the things that I got really badly wrong in Europe Reborn. I thought that Putin was integrating into the West. Well, he was actually until 2007, 2008, and it's with the dissolution of the international order after the financial crisis, the threat to multilateralism, that there's a new Russian policy. So the vision is very, very different to the one that has this simple argument that it's globalization that's destroying democracy. So if we want to restore democracy, we need to push back on globalization. That's actually the message on the whole of people who are peddling really quite destructive fantasies about what national autonomy would look like. The question is how to manage it and how to construct meaningful communications and meaningful social communications between very large groups. So in a way, going back to those early slides this afternoon, to Eugen Weber's argument about what created France in the 19th century, what creates modern Europe, what can create democracy. I'm not sure, to go back to the panel debate that you just heard, that having simple discussions is a good way of doing it, but to have people who are moving backwards and forwards may be a better way of doing it, and so movement in many, many directions rather than simple one-way flows is going to be a really constructive thing. And if you think of European countries that have been big successes over the last decades, they are countries that had at one period big emigrations. Ireland and Poland, both in the 1980s, were miserable economic performers and had enormous emigration. When they started to be successful, some of the emigration came back and some came back with skills. So constant communications, constant flows of people is going to be a good thing. And you can think, I think, if you want to go along the full Eugen Weber route, education, thinking of bringing European educational systems together. I mean, that occurs through Erasmus, but having it outside the higher education sphere, having some people talk about a European social year. Those are all ideas. That would be the contemporary analogy, I think, to having a national army. You don't want compulsory military service that's not an argument that I think will be attractive, but to have a one-year period in which Europeans work in a different country on social projects in hospitals, old people's homes, that's something that actually deepens the fabric. So without having something that really resembles that first picture of the Athenians listening to Pericles and being able to communicate with Pericles, it's going to be pretty impossible to think about anything that goes beyond the nation state. But once you start to have these flows, and you then think of the fiscal consequences of doing that, but to have that, to think about the fiscal consequences, I think, is a whole other subject. So it may be the subject of a different kind of conference. The big message that I wanted to leave you with is the idea that we shouldn't think of a simple trade-off between democracy and globalization, or between national sovereignty and globalization, but we need to think of ways engaging the communities in bigger communities outside the national setting. Only if you do that can this look like a world in which there's genuine participation, and in which some of the European problems, the low growth problems, they can be resolved, I think, by realizing more of potential. But in order to realize more potential, you probably need to move. One of the most destructive thoughts, finally, is this anywhere versus somewhere story. The more you can demolish that distinction, the more you're going to succeed in building democracy. Thank you very much.
Please, for this perspective. When I was listening to you, two questions came to my mind. And then, sorry, I will open it to the debate. The first one is, you started off with Weimar, and many of your colleagues do. And there's a tendency to say we can learn from the extremes. My question is, but what if in the extreme, perhaps different mechanisms are operating than in, how should I say, in the normal course of an economy and society? And therefore the question is, if we see dangers to democracy today, are they basically similar in kind and in mechanism than what we saw then? Or should we really think about different mechanisms? Let me say this, like the difference between classical mechanics and quantum mechanics, right? Yeah. One is not just like the other at a larger scale, but they operate on different mechanisms. So would you say that we can still say there's similar mechanism, or is it like classic mechanics versus quantum mechanics?
I mean, I think I would see a continuum rather than a kind of classical distinction there. But to some extent, I mean, this is sort of basically repeating also what I wanted to finish up with there, is that if you've got a big and powerful and viable multilateral structure, if you have something like the European Union, or indeed the monetary union, it actually it acts as a kind of constraint, and to some extent, I mean, this was a quite deliberate mechanism in the early 1950s when the founding fathers of the European project think about what they're doing. Is that they're taking some really contentious areas, coal and steel, at first, that were really at the center of distributive conflicts outside the national setting, and making it harder as a result to alter that. Or another very powerful example of that is what the United States administration did in the last phases of the Second World War, pushing the international monetary agreements in Bretton Woods. One part of that was the realization that they'd done something in the New Deal which could be reversed by a subsequent American administration. But what they wanted to do was to lock in the New Deal internationally. And so, locking in things through international arrangements is a classical way. If you look at it from one perspective, of course, it's constraining national sovereignty, but actually, it's making more productive choices possible. So, I think the Weimar example gets so out of hand in large part because the international framework has been destroyed already by 1932. So before Hitler becomes chancellor.
So the recession or the Big Depression was not the only factor. I mean, for people who look at the numbers, actually see that it was as severe in the United States as in Germany, and the results were different. But let me come back to, and later toward this triangle that you said, and perhaps concentrating at the center. One remark which you made about the difference between the larger and the smaller countries. And you mentioned en passant that after the war, we had a bipolar system in the larger countries and a more multi-party system in the smaller countries, common and supported by a social consensus. And the social consensus was basically, we are small, we have to be together. Now the question is, how small have the big countries become in the meantime? Because the world has expanded, and shouldn't the larger countries, Italy, France, Germany, even now start to feel also politically more like a smaller country, which would allow them to go to a multi-party system, but knowing basically that there's China out there, so that they develop, if you want, the mentality of the smaller countries.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really excellent point. I think it's actually a productive one to follow up. But maybe again, I like to think of it as a historian. The countries that are always given as examples of this, that sort of really got to the post-war consensus before the Second World War, are Switzerland and Sweden. And so they had very, very antagonistic class relationships. And Switzerland, at least, was pretty much at the end of the First World War in a near civil war. But then when they have this really powerful and dangerous country to the north of them in Germany, and it's similar for Sweden, it's clear that you've got to react and you've got to get together. And, I mean, clearly it was, I think, one of the sets of thoughts that, in a world that's got really big countries, economic powers like China, or military superpowers like Russia, even France or Britain with their own nuclear capacity can't do very much, and so they really need to cooperate. And so, I think in the sense that the world has got more conflictual since 2008, since the financial crisis, and that also increases the premium for European countries to behave more. They should think more of themselves as the equivalent of Switzerland and Sweden in the 1930s and look for some sort of solidarity.
Perhaps the emphasis was on should, as we saw during the previous session. Some of them are not quite there yet. I have a bit difficulty seeing the public, but if you can raise your hand, and I can see barely a hand here on the third row, and then at the very end there, and then here. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot of smoke in this room. I mean, it's designed to get this powerful visual effect.
Okay, that's much better. Yeah, over
yes.
there. Yeah.
Okay, hi, Joanna Bryson, Hertie School of Governance. I was surprised that one of the things you mentioned as a problem for the Weimar Republic that was here.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Was that the proliferation of parties. Because it seems to me that I could see why it's a problem, but it's actually a symptom of the loss of control to some extent. Wouldn't you say? And let me put a second piece to that same question. It seems to me that you have these problems when you have extremely high inequality, and so individuals have so much money that they aren't necessarily using the conventional institutions. And so that's part of the reason it's harder for democracies to hold their control together.
Yeah, I mean, there are actually 2 points there. One is about inequality, and I would like to deal with that. The other is about the proliferation of party systems. Well, one of the things that the makers of Weimar wanted to do was to make sure that absolutely everybody was represented. And so they said, if you get a certain number of votes for your political movement, you get a seat in the parliament, in the Reichstag, so that we hear absolutely every voice. That also has a kind of echo for some of the debates that you had in the previous session. Do you really want to hear every little cranky voice? I'm not sure that you do. You want to hear every voice that's capable of making a persuasive argument that persuades a lot of people. And that's the argument for having traditional parties, large parties, which are compromises. The traditional Democratic Party in the United States, or the Republican Party, were very, very broad coalitions. The Labour Party, Conservative Party, were big coalitions. There were Christian socialists in the Labour Party, and very, very anti-clerical atheists. But it's a coalition. They have to be a coalition. You have to make compromises, and that I think is actually a really powerful lesson of the some of those interwar catastrophes. And indeed, in the Federal Republic, famously, you have one of the lessons of that, which is that you don't get represented unless you get over 5%. And 5% is arbitrary. It may be too low, maybe too high, but it's surely true that you don't want to hear every kind of crank. And the second point about inequality, you want to be careful, I think, if you think that it's inequality that drives the radicalization of the interwar period. It's not really. The world became a great deal more, countries became more equal as a result of the First World War. The First World War, and the aftermath of the First World War, was a massive destruction of wealth, of the high wealth people. But what it is there's less inequality in the 1920s, but more distributional conflict. And you think that some kind of central state lever, fiscal policy or monetary policy, can alter that distributional thing. So you want to capture the mechanism that leads to the distribution. That's really part of the poison, I think, of the Weimar system.
To the fork, I see a question over there.
Thank you very much, Professor James, for a brilliant lecture. Stephen Blockman, CEPS. I wanted to take the first point that Dieter raised a little further and maybe ask you how we might educate peasants to become Europeans and make them think more so that they can deliberate more on EU issues at a national level. And I wonder whether you could find distilled perhaps from your academic lecture and also the book by Weber some policy prescriptions in this sense. You referred to infrastructure works in France, railways. You referred to civic duty, to socialization as a result of conscription rather in the army. Could we learn something from this at the European level, and if so, what?
Yes, I think I'm glad you asked that question, because it's also a point that that came up in a number of the sessions, and I got this point from two of the different sessions over the past 2 days. That is one of the things that distinguishes the peasants, as it were, the somewheres, the people who are deeply rooted in their locality, is that they're massively cut off from many basic services. So the school system doesn't exist properly in big countries with large rural hinterlands in France or Italy. Very, very few local schools. Medical services, that's really important. Doctors, it's impossible to find doctors in those areas. In Eastern Germany, in the eastern states where the AfD does very well, the Allianz für Deutschland, one of the big complaints is about the poor provision of medical services. Now, there are quite imaginative ways of fixing that. In the United States, we're having a big move to telemedicine, and you can imagine that contagious diseases will push that even further. I want to be able to communicate with a skilled medical professional very, very quickly. I don't necessarily want to be in physical proximity with that professional because of the contagion risk, but if I can show exactly what my problem is, I put the smartphone in the right position, and you can get an enormous amount of medical advice. So there are areas, I think, that really can be dealt with quite imaginative processes. But it's often vested interest groups. The medical profession is resistant to this, but the medical profession is, as a result, really penalizing people who live in remote areas.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Wolfgang Pape. I'm associated with CEPS as well, formerly in the European Commission. You started off very impressively with pictures of the Agora in Athens, which is, in our understanding, a local governance. But we here in Europe are very much aware of multi-level governance. That means you can do something at local level, which is different from going all the way to global level. And I wonder, shouldn't we adapt our models of democracy to different levels of the governance, starting with a local where you can have very direct democracy. People know if they want to have a kindergarten or football stadium in the neighborhood. But on the other hand, the higher you get, already at provincial and national level, you need more and more filtration, as it's called nowadays, because you cannot have direct, everyday decision by the people to decide what is happening at national level, for instance. And then we get to the European level, where we are supposed to discuss it today, now here. There we have already a very high level of technocracy, its expertise, and the European Commission, with its quasi-monopoly of legislation, still has some kind of technocratic priority over the parliament, which is the representative democracy here. And you go then further to the global level, where still the nation is the only sovereign intergovernmental actor. We should change the model of democracy according to this level where we are governing here, and at European level. And that's my question now. What kind of democracy would you like to have? What do you see as appropriate here? Thank you.
Well, no, I think that's a very, very good and important question. I mean, the conventional word to use about that discussion, I think, is the principle of subsidiarity, that you deal with the things that can be best dealt with at the local level there. And it's only the issues of overarching importance, if you think of CO2 or many kinds of environmental issues, those can't be dealt with locally, and they shouldn't be dealt with locally. So, if it's a question of providing the best bus service, that's the local authority that deals with that. And indeed, I think you can find over Europe very, very powerful and effective local authorities, and many of the best political careers have begun in local government. I mean, there's a kind of it's a sort of interesting discussion. Above all, some Swiss academics have really pushed this. That's exactly the way to go. That it's a congregation of regions that should be really thinking about how big decisions are made, and you want regionalism, but you can also imagine overlapping regionalism, or in a global world, you can imagine communities of interest. What we do as scholars. Actually, we talk often much more to our colleagues in Harvard or MIT or Berkeley than we do to the people who live down the corridor from me in my department in Princeton. So we create all kinds of networks, not just local networks. And I think it's important to add that other element to the discussion. And it goes even to the question, how do you convince farmers to be Europeans? If there are new techniques, then they may be interesting to people who are not just in one particular locality, but they can be spread through new communications, through social media.
We are running a bit over time. If you allow me, I will just take a last round and we bundle some questions. Okay. First of all, we had somebody here in the second row who was quite patient. And sorry, we can, since we bundle them, if you can ask that question over there, and then you get immediately.
Thanks a lot. I'm Tina, researcher here at CEPS. As you talked about trade and economic things, I would like to hear your opinions and ideas on the globalization and its discontent, as Stiglitz would put it. And what I mean is that I think why these extreme rhetorics exist, that globalization kills democracy, is increased inequality, as the other attendee also mentioned. And because we have a lot of losers and winners of globalization. And the winners are usually the countries who design and implement the global rules, and then the winners, and the losers are the ones who try to follow on. So I was wondering what are your opinions and ideas, how globalization could result into more equal picture at the end of the day, where the trade rules and are not stuck, for instance, as it is now in the WTO. Thanks.
Okay. Then you can wonder. Okay. Here in the second row.
Marek Dąbrowski, Bruegel and Case. I would like to ask you the same question which I yesterday asked Ivan Krastev about the role of changes in public communication, public debate over the last 2 decades. This is a problem which you didn't address in your very interesting presentation. I absolutely agree with your comments on the globalization, on migration. But still, we have the problems with increasing number of countries. We have increasing polarization of political scene. We have less merit-based political debate, more emotional, and so I would be interested in your comments on this role of this factor.
Okay, I have the permission of our speaker to take very short questions over there to my right.
Thank you. Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. I wanted to pick up your point about, I'm not quite sure what you called it, artificial communities, or community as an artificial construct. And you sort of made the point with what you said about your closer connections with your colleagues in Harvard and MIT than with your colleagues down the corridor. Brexiters in the UK have more connections with the populists of the Republican Party in the US than they do with me, and I have more connections to liberals on the continent of Europe than I do to, my near neighbours who voted for the UKIP party. How do you think you overcome that that fragmentation? How do you get me and my UKIP neighbour to feel that we belong to one community?
Hello, Mikko Salo from Faktabaari. Basically, more of an observation, actually, following a colleague here. Democracy in the digital age, and this is a little bit the link that I'm missing because I think it's wonderful that we have the perspective to the democracy, and we have to be reminded on that type of things. But this another observation, also the book that was referred, How Democracies Die, it really doesn't go too deep on the internet. What has that caused for our democracy, and can we make the parallels? I was wondering that we could certainly learn from the history, but also kind of look for the future. So if you have how can we engage the debate between the historians and the people who are really developing the world that we are living at the moment? Thank you.
Well, 4 really great questions. If I go in reverse order, you do get the point that there are these kind of communication bubbles, and maybe that's also relevant to Mr. Bond's question. Why it's difficult to communicate with your UKIP neighbour. But that was also, I think, a world that existed for many centuries, really. That communities were quite divided, and so it wasn't necessarily the case that one village was just one community of solidarity, but there were really acute differences. Who goes to church on Sunday, who doesn't go to church? Sometimes it's compulsory. Those kind of questions were really deeply divisive, and so sometimes you thought that actually you were better off in a bigger community. There are many parallels, I think, with nation building in the 19th century. That, for instance, the citizens in what became Northern Bavaria after the Treaty of Vienna, the Congress of Vienna, they didn't like being ruled by Munich, and so they wanted something bigger to take place of Bavaria, and so they thought Germany was great. And people who don't like the German government or the Italian government can see things in Europe, and so the more you construct bigger communities, actually you can I think at least make this argument that you can find a counterweight to the unpleasant neighbor that you have. There's obviously no answer to the question how to deal with an awkward neighbor except get a better community, and the better community often means a bigger community. I wanted to, I don't know whether I have a really good answer on the kind of, also the Ivan Krastev discussion yesterday on the communications, except, maybe again to say, this is, we think always we're living in something very, very new, but it's not clear. If I go back to the Weimar example, people had local grievances, very incompatible local grievances. And then, characteristically, what one of these radical right rallies would, or the Nazi Party rally would look like, is that, first of all, a local speaker would say things that were relevant to the local community. And then after a long period of time, the national speaker would come and say, we need a strengthened Germany, we need national renewal, blah, blah, blah. And somehow the two were meant to go together. But there was always a question of trying to go beyond a local level in terms of getting answers to particular problems. The very first question of this round on globalization, I don't think you should think of globalization as producing winners and losers that are countries. I think an important part of the new literature, just a nice new book by Branka Milanovic, is that inequality within countries is increasing, inequality in regions is increasing, but inequality between countries is not necessarily increasing. Actually, it's decreased quite dramatically, and so it's not the case, for instance, that the UK or the United States is a loser of globalization. Some people are winners, some people are losers. And it's also the case, I think, that you have to view this in terms of a longer-term context, that what your current position is not necessarily indicative of what your future position will be. And we tend to be worried people. So if we're losing, we know all about that, but we don't imagine the possible ways in which we might gain in the future. And, you know, again, part of the idea of linking people more across, and more imaginatively, more creatively, is that people can be aware of the possibilities and the potentialities. And so they can think, well, yes, at the moment, the occupation that I've been trained to do doesn't exist, but I can do something else. And that, I think, is a moment of genuine optimism. And, you know, I like to close, on the whole, with a note of optimism. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Allow me one reflection, a bit on the entire Ideas Lab. We started off with our warm-up session on democracy and some research results which showed that people in theory, everybody's for democracy, but apparently not many people think vibrant opposition parties are important. Then we had Ivan Krastev, who talked about the light that failed, the feeling, at least in many parts of Europe, that this liberal order has failed them. And then I want to come back to the two books you mentioned and I mentioned. You went from Europe Reborn to Europe Contested. In a sense, what we saw also was that we had democracy reborn in Europe in the 1990s and democracy contested. Our hope in choosing this title was actually that democracy would be reborn in Europe. And this is the feeling that I have from these days and this talk today, that is our task, not only all the detailed things that we have discussed, that we must collaborate and must somehow contribute to a rebirth of democracy in Europe. And one of the key elements, as you said, was this feeling of being in there together, not only economically, but also politically and socially. And this is one takeaway from me, that this is perhaps the larger task ahead for our policymakers. And I think we all wish them good luck on that road. And I wish you all a happy weekend. Stay safe and have a good returning back home. Thank you very much.